on a scene-based mission, and they almost like, by definition, are being local, or at least, to get academic for a moment, trans-local. Andy Bennett, has described this idea, there's a metal scene in every city, there's a hip-hop scene in every city, and even though these sort of micro scenes are pretty small, they can connect up globally and you can kind of speak to an audience. But what's really interesting from what Everett was saying, from what you were saying is, well, Everett, you were saying that Kurt Cobain pretty early on said, we want to be big, right? And you're saying, like with the presets, you go, well, actually, we want to really consciously try and synthesize some stuff together to kind of like build a movement here. So that would seem to me to be, we ought to start shifting our perceptions around how we view the indie scene, should we not? I mean, do you think that's a pattern? So Scott, definitely. Maybe in the bands you're working with, do you think that's a trend?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the state of the music industry as well, and the sort of people losing confidence with major labels, and it is. I mean, a big thing that I'm always saying to bands is develop a practice. A fine arts practice in a sense with your music, but also develop an artistic practice with business. Because realistically, you've got to be creative, just as creative and just as innovative with developing your band's image or a style as you are with the music.
Okay, so maybe throwing to Stephen now, in a sense that, I mean, these stories that we're hearing around, the historical example of Nirvana and then a more recent example of presets, from your more perspective of doing like promo and marketing for acts in recent years, are you seeing an emergence of a more sort of savvy, particularly on the indie scene, people who are way more aware of the kind of trying to reach target audiences and they're more attuned to that?
I think that probably people could afford to be a little bit more in tune with that. I mean, I still see a lot of bands that are expecting that the media coverage they get is going to break them, as opposed to focusing on the product that they're putting out there. And a lot of people kind of balk at that and say, don't fuck with my art. But the product that we've just gone through there with Presets and Nirvana is not necessarily just their music. It's about what they see themselves as. It's about the brands they hook up with, the scenes that they're in, the labels that, whether it's fashion labels or record labels or whatever it happens to be. It's about the way that they put the whole lot together. And I don't, apart from obviously MTV being a factor in Nirvana, I don't think anybody there made a record and then sat back and waited for a radio station to break them, or you create it and then the media kind of the juggernaut kind of rolls on. And I think that's what helps build it, but you've got to have those ingredients there to start with.
Okay, so in terms of like, in being active in terms of synthesizing elements, like, I mean, I've often thought that, if we talk about some of these examples, there's a certain amount of like catalysing the zeitgeist of the moment, like the band that's able to put up a lightning rod and go, I've catalysed the feeling of the moment in terms of the scene, or I'm able to form a connection across 2 or 3 different things that then aggregate into this big, momentum. So particularly, say around the presets, Scott, you were saying before that, the way that the music then connected with, Subi, a fashion design movement, and you could probably go right back to, say, the Pistols and Vivienne Westwood and, Sex Pistols, and so there was a sort of a catalysing, and also Jamie Reed's artwork, and so there was a whole sort of coming together of like various elements that when people saw the end result, it was like, wow, that's got an incredibly distinctive edge. So I mean, I guess what I'm after is kind of a sense to which people were consciously trying to synthesize things that they thought would be somehow distinctive. I mean, Scott, do you think with the presets, these guys are thinking, if we can really forge these connections, and how much were they conscious of these connections?
Well, I think it's a big group effort. I mean, someone from the US looking at the presets, they might think, well, there's this band doing that, but when you're in Sydney, I mean, there's 15 bands that are together doing that thing. It's not just them. So, one point would be to, you know, it's a cultural movement. So, you know, every Saturday night there would be a club that these bands would be going to and DJing, and you know, it was more of a larger movement that certain bands who are maybe hungrier than the other bands shoot out of. That, you know, it's not, I don't think it's always just, you know, a solo, them being solo. It's you know, a movement that sort of trajects certain things, and people come out of that.
They can park themselves on. I mean, I think that's kind of interesting. I mean, what I wanted to now do is maybe have a look at the role of critics and throw to Everett on this particular issue. I mean, is it that when people sort of synthesize something that has a sort of a kind of a presence, is there an element of that critics are looking for the story or the myth around this particular phenomenon? And when the Seattle scene was, you know, emerging and getting noticed, was there a sense that from a writer's point of view, that you guys were kind of looking at making a story or a legend around this scene? Was that an important element for you guys in terms of writing about that scene?
Well, just to sidetrack a second, Australian Idol. Okay, why do critics hate Australian Idol so much?
Come in somewhere.
Why do critics hate Australian Idol so much? Because there's not particularly any reason. There's not particularly any difference in the music being produced by Australian Idol in the charts. That's the whole point. It's exactly the same. The reason is because there's no backstory. There's none of that myth that you can create around it, because boom, it's being created right in front of your eyes, and that's what the critics and what the media hates the most, because there's nothing to write about. You know, so they have to write about the most ridiculous things imaginable. Going back to Seattle, look, you turn up at a city, there's a bunch of rock bands all playing loud, fast, furious rock music, all plying you with alcohol and drugs and other stuff, and of course you're going to have a good time.
And it's a good story. So in terms of, so Stephen, when it comes to doing a promo campaign for an act, this idea of the backstory, I mean, when you get an act that comes to you and says, all right, Stephen, we want to work with you, we want you to actually push this next record, is that a really important element for you to get the backstory on the act to create a sense of, you know, what's distinctive, what can we say about this act?
Well, I think you've got to find out whatever the story is that's going to connect with the fan, and essentially, you know, what you've got to do is make an individual connection between the music or the act and each individual person. At some point, when you've got a massive fan base, every one of those fans might have actually connected with something different about it, whether it is the backstory. And a lot of people will connect with the backstory. They'll be, you know, that's just like me. I had an abusive childhood, or I came out of that scene, or I was from that suburb, or whatever. For other people, it'll be a merging of where they first heard that song. You know, essentially, to become a really big fan of an artist, I think it's kind of more about making a lifestyle connection with the music and the artist between the fan.
Maybe shift the focus a little bit now and talk about the sort of enablers or disablers of the buzz. And I want to sort of, first of all, maybe start around radio. And I think it's something that many of you have had pretty direct experience with. You know, there's obviously a lot of debate, particularly in Australia, because, you know, we have very limited channels in terms of exposing acts to audiences. Around the question of, well, in the first instance, maybe Triple J, and the importance of a network like that.